Cleves Whitney, Director of the Hallenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley, and I welcome you to this very special talk today. You know, talks like this are made possible because of partnerships. And here to my right, you can see the partnerships that are involved. Of course, Grand Valley is happy to help partner along with the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, and Elaine Didier, the director here, asked me to send her regards and to thank you for attending. And also we have the Duncan Littlefair Great Speakers Series, Fountain Street Church, which are part of this. My job today is going to be done very briefly. I'll dispatch it by introducing Ruth Stein to come to the podium. Ruth?
Thank you, Gleaves. And Duncan Littlefair, on behalf of the board of the Duncan Littlefair Great Speakers Series, we want to thank the Hallenstein Center for Presidential Studies and the Ford Museum for allowing us to partner up with them and have this program in here today. Over the last 120 years, there's been an amazing series of speakers at Fountain Street Church. Susan B. Anthony, Winston Churchill, Eleanor Roosevelt, Margaret Mead, Helen Keller, Linus Pauling, Malcolm X, and those are just a few of the signatures on our Green Room guest book. But not the least of those challenging and eloquent and enlightening voices at Fountain Street was Duncan Littlefair. He was the senior minister there for some 40 years and really the founder of the modern Fountain Street Church. So a year or so ago, when we decided we wanted to sort of regularize our speakers series and reinvigorate the program, it was natural that we made it the Duncan Littlefair Great Speakers Series. The governing board of the series, and we've got a number of them here today. Tony Cruz is here. I don't know, maybe they're going to sort of, there he is, there's Tony. And David Doyle, Celia Said, Diane Herbruck, and Kirsten Lundeen. We are, along with myself, we are determined to make this series, take it to a new level, to make it scheduling more predictable. We plan a spring and a fall program, so you can just note that in your calendars right now. And we want to engage the community more directly, maybe even inspire some real change. As we say, free the mind, grow the soul, change the world. And by the way, we really are working on a very exciting spring program about human shelter. We want to challenge your concepts of sustainability and community, and that'll be happening first week of April, and we expect Sarah Susanka, the New York Times bestselling author, to be our keynoter then. In any case, as a new element in our programs, we are planning to partner regularly, as we have done this time with the Hallenstein Center, with other organizations in our community. We're looking for a natural fit so that our keynote speakers can go into more depth or maybe explore another facet of their work with another organization and an invited audience so that we have a sort of deeper, more interesting program. And welcome, you're at the first of those programs. And of course, tomorrow our keynote event is at Fountain Street Church at 2 o'clock. Tickets are $10. You can get them at the Schuler's bookstores or at Literary Life. You can get them at the door. And students are free, and we can give, if you have a student ID here today, Tony would be very happy to get you a ticket. So, as a fellow journalist, I'm honored to introduce John Hockenberry. John grew up here in Grand Rapids. He studied at the University of Chicago and the University of Oregon and is now engaged in a highly distinguished career. He has served as a TV correspondent and anchor at NBC, MSNBC, and ABC, winning a total of 4 Emmys for coverage that ranged from New York newsrooms to Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia. But I have to think that his natural home is radio. He keeps returning to NPR, where he started out at the Foreign Desk. He covered the Middle East. He anchored Heat and the DNA Files. He's been a regular contributor to The Infinite Mind and hosted Talk of the Nation. John's earned at least 3, is it 3 or 4 Peabodys? I think I lost track trying to count them up.
I think it's 3.
Three.
We'll leave it at 3.
You're using them as doorstops
Yeah,
now? Maybe?
yeah, right.
Yeah, for his work at
My
NPR.
kids love to play with them.
Yes. And he's currently co-hosting a news program called The Takeaway, which is unfortunately not heard on the radio in this part of the state, but you can listen online. And if all that isn't enough, he's also written for some little nothing publications like the Washington Post, the New Yorker magazine, the New York Times. He's published 2 books, a novel and a memoir, and he adapted the memoir into a one-man off-Broadway show. The one thing I can tell you I think he has positively never done is bowled a 300 game. So without anything further from me, ladies and gentlemen, John Hockenberry.
Thank you. Now, I had insisted that the bowling business not come up, so I'm a little upset. Yeah, bowling is not my strength. It's great to be here. What a terrific crowd. I mean, I think in my day, in the mid-'70s, if I was hanging around down here by the river on a Saturday, we wouldn't be thinking much about politics. Back in those days, there were none of these, terrific facilities, and this was a part of town, as many of you remember, where you got away from it all. Now, if you're caught just sort of hanging around by the river, thinking aimlessly and sloppily about life, you might be credibly accused of being an Al-Qaeda sleeper cell or something, and people would ask, "What are you doing here?" So it's great to be back in a community that is certainly so resurgent and vibrant, and an occasion that is really quite interesting and relates to very personal experiences that I had growing up here in Grand Rapids. I suspect many of you paid close attention to the election on Tuesday. Right, there we go, yes indeed. And there's an enormous amount to say about what happened on Tuesday, both in terms of what's new and in terms of what's very, very traditional about the way Americans deal with change in the voting booth. Whether that is a partisan thing or whether that is about our very complex relationship that we have with Washington and government in the United States, and a complexity that's only underscored by stories like Keith Olbermann getting suspended for making political contributions. Say what you want about Keith Olbermann or Juan Williams or Glenn Beck or any of the media outlets. The cacophony in America's media right now, more than anything, whether you want to talk about partisanship or what is the role of a journalist, or are we all a bunch of biased, lefties or righties, so whatever sort of epithet you would like to throw at us, and I'm happy to field any of them today from any of you. Truly, it's part of my job. But we have an anxiety about what is the definition and what is appropriate civic engagement right now. Is it voting? Is it being in business? Is it providing jobs? Is it investing? Is it political campaigning? Is it politically contributing? Is it simply talking intelligently amongst ourselves about the future of American democracy? Or is it, watching Glenn Beck or Bill O'Reilly or Keith Olbermann or Rachel Maddow and going, yeah, that's right, what they said, sort of a kind of collectivized agreement, which then becomes, rallies on the Mall for Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert or Glenn Beck, entertainment moments that are dressed up as incidences of democracy. We're not really sure what's actually going on here. I mean, we understand that people like Keith Olbermann is a civically engaged individual who might be expected to have proclivities in one direction or the other, and so we're hardly surprised that he gave money to political candidates. But is it General Electric's purview to say whether or not he can be civically engaged or not, and whether the disclosure of that is something that we need to know about or discredits his discourse? Our civic engagement and the means by which we engage in this democracy, those channels are in conflict, and so a contribution becomes then a suppression of speech. He'll be back on the air, of course. In some sense, General Electric would love to brand itself as not completely liberal on its property, MSNBC, and of course, General Electric is no longer the owner of MSNBC. As of the next couple of months, it will be Comcast, which has a whole other different agenda. Brian Williams, of course, famously likes to say he doesn't vote as a way of being civically engaged and objective. But then, in some abstract sense, I suppose that's appropriate. But someone who doesn't vote just seems like a person that would not be terribly credible to talk politics with. Have you ever had one of these discussions where people are going, and I think this, and I think that, and then if you well, I didn't vote the last 2 times. Well, why am I paying any attention to you kind of conversation? I'm sure any of you have had these sorts of, well, if you don't vote, why are you so passionate about X, Y, or Z? One could certainly say that about journalists as well. And of course, the huge irony behind all of it is that the corporate entities, whether they're National Public Radio or a nonprofit corporation, or General Electric, which owned NBC during the entire time I was there, Disney, which owned ABC during the entire time I was there, you know, they all have enormously robust lobbying organizations and interests in Washington. GE, for instance, trying to get particular weapon systems with General Electric engines in them. I think at the time that NBC was covering the war in Iraq, GE had a specific, $120 million contract with the federal government to provide power in Baghdad once the war was over, which ought to color our views of the Brian Williamses of the world. Okay, so you don't vote, but you work for a company that has an interest in the war that exceeds the entire budget of your news division. What does that say about your coverage? I'm not saying anything bad about Brian Williams. It's just that it's much more complicated than simply writing a few checks to some candidates. And again, I'm not a big fan of Keith Olbermann. I actually, since I used to work at MSNBC, I happen to know that there's a huge backstory with Keith and his bosses, and this could have had everything to do with the kind of ping pong that they're playing. And so it was like, now we can suspend him. That'll show him. So he'll be back, and they'll be doing their various sorts of backstabbing things. Who knows what's going on? I've been out of the NBC business for a while, but that could just as easily explain what's going on. However, the fact that it's a headline underscores this anxiety that we have about civic engagement. So that's sort of the frame here. But then what happened on Tuesday? Did the Tea Party score some huge victory? Is the GOP leadership being challenged by some sort of insurgency on the ground? Is the change that Barack Obama so apparently effectively articulated in 2008 being rolled back in some significant sense? Is the health care debate of the 2008 election now all about eradicating the changes that were made over the last 2 years? Well, it depends on which district you're talking about, and it depends on where in the country you go to look at the results of the elections. But the important thing for all of us, I think, is to, and particularly as we try to evaluate the blanket statements that are going to be made and that already have been made about what happened on Tuesday, is to sort out what is cyclical about what happened here. And of course, as we all know, the president rarely, if ever, gains seats in the midterm elections in the first term. It just doesn't happen. George W. Bush gained in 2002, largely as a result of the once in a generation 9/11 event, which completely co-opted and changed the political discourse at the time. Franklin Roosevelt gained in 1934. And there, I think it was because it was really for two reasons. One, the extraordinary effectiveness of the Democratic Party in the 30s to mobilize the anger at government and the ability of government to deliver services was a very real, tangible experience for voters in the 1930s. And it created a base that had not existed before. And so, but those gains were reversed, as we went through the 1930s. And really, the Democratic, the economic coalition of Franklin Delano Roosevelt was really on the ropes by the time you get to 1938, which partially begins to explain Roosevelt's interest in getting involved in the war, along with Winston Churchill, because the war became this gigantic engine to do what the government actually could not do, and that was restart the U.S. economy. And I guess Churchill might have made some of those points if I had been there during his speech at Fountain Street. And I have to say, Ruth, you really sort of intimidated me with that list of names, Susan B. Anthony. And so we're starting with John Hockenberry. It's kind of an off year for us here at Fountain Street. Sarah Palin's working on the reality show, but local boy, that's good. That's good. But seriously, I mean, obviously, I'm so thrilled and honored to be back in the community. And my thoughts tomorrow about my own relationship with Fountain Street will distinguish that talk from this here. But that's all I'll say about rolling in the footsteps of Winston Churchill, who I certainly admire. I'd like to begin by telling you a story of an embarrassing moment as a high school teenager here, which probably, okay, a guy comes back, he's got a certain amount of notoriety as a local boy, and he's going to start with some embarrassing stories about things that he did in Grand Rapids. Great, why did I waste? I could have gone to Home Depot today. Instead, I'm sitting here listening to this. But in fact, my embarrassing moment, and it's certainly not the only embarrassing moment I had as a teenager in Grand Rapids, but my truly career-defining embarrassing moment involved Gerald R. Ford as a congressman, and involved me trying to be a debater, which would eventually be a skill that would develop into my identity as a journalist. And so I'll tell you this story as really the beginning of an experience that became a window on what happened last Tuesday that takes me right back to 1974. Gerald R. Ford, a few years before, maybe a year and a half before he was drafted by the Nixon administration to be vice president, because Spiro Agnew's problems, which seemed to be formidable when he was actually nominated to be vice president at the Republican convention, but were unable to hold back Richard Nixon, who was a huge dynamo of Republican challenge to the serious winds of change and turmoil that were going on in 1968. And so Agnew, as a bit of a joke on the late night talk shows, Johnny Carson at the time, really sort of hung on as vice president until he became involved in serious corruption, or at least it came to light from when he was governor of Maryland. And he pleaded noli contendere, as many of you remember, and had to be sort of sent packing. So to find a centrist, clean as a whistle Republican, you could do no better than to come to the 3rd District of Michigan and find Jerry Ford, who was then minority leader, I believe, in the House of Representatives at the time. And Jerry came to East Grand Rapids High School when I was there as a freshman or a sophomore. I was a new student. I had come from upstate New York. I was new to East Grand Rapids. I was new to Grand Rapids. I was certainly new to Western Michigan. I was new to the Midwest, even though I had been born in Ohio. And Dayton, Ohio is more the South than the Midwest, if you've ever been to Ohio. So I didn't really understand the kind of upright sort of don't talk too much, and certainly don't talk like a New Yorker, and you'll be okay. And I immediately signed up for the debate team, and so I was talking all the time. And my experience in Syracuse had been as kind of an anti-war junior high school protester. So I was this sort of nascent, 12-year-old lefty who believed that he'd experienced Woodstock or something, and then suddenly went to East Grand Rapids High School, where the big issue was the tennis team. And so I experienced a huge kind of culture shock. Obviously, it was more significant than the tennis team, but I had this kind of self-righteous sort of maybe little, Oberman-esque robot kind of quality there at East Grand Rapids High School. So when Jerry Ford came to town, well, yeah, I certainly wasn't going to let him off the hook, now was I? No. I was going to ask the tough question. While all the other students at East Grand Rapids dutifully asked the nice, polite questions like, what's it like to be a congressman, and what do you think about American democracy, and do you support the war or not, and the questions that people were asking. And of course, by this time, the war was winding down. What do you think of? I don't think anyone asked a question about Watergate. It was probably before. It was probably right in the '72 campaign when Jerry Congressman visited the high school. But I raised my hand, and in his opening remarks, he had said something about being responsible for getting federal money to, fight crime and to basically support police departments around the United States. And I went, okay, here's my thing, right? The police, I'm coming from Syracuse, New York, where at the protests where we went, the police are like the enemy. Everybody sort of understands that, right? Even in Western Michigan, sure, yeah. So I get up and I ask my question. I say, Congressman Ford, you mentioned that federal money needs to go to support anti-crime programs in economically distressed, and I probably didn't use economically distressed. I can't imagine if I was even remotely articulate. But I said in urban areas that have been the scene of race riots and serious economic conflict and even protests about the war, I failed to see, sir, how bigger guns and shinier badges is going to put a dent in crime. This is a packed high school auditorium, okay? The new kid, standing up. I was in a wheelchair at the time. Perhaps I wished I was in one at that point, because the hair started to stand up on the back of my head, and my ears got hot in that way that when you realize you've just completely, and there was like a groan of the girls in the 10th grade who were sitting in the row in front of us, like, who's that? And of course the pep rally people, were like, oh, thank you. He'll be back real soon, Jerry, of course, answered the question very politely and said, obviously, it's not about bigger guns and shinier badges, Mr. Clever Boy. And I don't think he said clever boy, but the implication was there. And, we moved on. And for weeks afterwards, my high school teachers would say, what was the idea there? There was a point, right? And certainly taught me very early on that if you have a congressman and you have an opportunity to find something out, at least ask a question that says more, where the answer to which will say more about the congressman than it says about you, as in my case, a smart-ass high school student. So that became a journey to a more articulate and responsible political discourse as a debater. And East Grand Rapids did very well when I was on the debate team. We went to state twice, and we were Class B as a school back then, and did very well in my junior year. By my senior year, we didn't do quite so well. We did go all the way to state, but we lost out in the finals of regionals. And as a embarrassing moment number two, I managed to get a hold of, and this was back in the days when you didn't even get carded as a 16-year-old here in Western Michigan, and I managed to get a hold of a bottle of rum, and we were in the hotel room, and it was after the tournament, and we'd lost out, and we kind of got a little wacky, and of course word got out. I even think one of the debaters' moms, who was on that trip, her son was there, at the time, watching the captain of the debate team dissemble a little bit. Well, I got suspended from school as a result. And this is all by way of explaining that I was part of the Richard Vanderveen campaign back in 1974. I had signed up to work as a precinct person. And the day of my suspension from school came on Election Day for that special election for Richard Vanderveen in 1974. And I was, as my mother is just spitting at me all day, you just destroyed and ruined the whole family. And I'm in my closet office there, working the rolls and calling the voters and getting out the vote on that very important election day, which was this huge national story, because was Jerry Ford's seat going to go Democrat in the middle of Watergate, of course, in 1974, and Richard Vanderveen, who I was going to school with his son Paul, who's now a great video journalist in Washington, D.C., and I've worked with him on a number of occasions. So, we were like, could a Democrat actually win? What does that mean? And what it meant really gets back to the issue of what happened on Tuesday. Well, for me, I was in there, and my precinct did really, really well. I can't remember exactly where it was, but I can remember just the look of those voter rolls and me calling up everybody, how are you getting to the polls, have you voted yet? And then calling in my central station and saying, these are the people who haven't voted yet, these are the people who need rides, these are the people who say they are going, these are the people who need another call. We were monitoring it, probably about 1,000, 1,200 or more registered Democrats that we were trying to get out to the polls, because at this particular moment in 1974, Republicans, even in Western Michigan, had just had enough of Richard Nixon and what was going on, and either they felt as though Nixon was being hounded from office by this Watergate thing, and they were embittered by the whole thing, or they just felt that Richard Nixon, who had won this huge mandate in 1972 over George McGovern, basically it sent the Democratic Party back to the library as like an overdue book. That's how relevant they were in 1972, and all of a sudden, boom, by 1974, an extraordinary and complete reversal had taken place. And so the issue was, if every single Democrat in the 3rd District came out, Richard Vanderveen had a chance, because there was a suspicion that a lot of the Republicans were going to stay home. It was a special election, so turnout is always a big issue in special elections. And sure enough, Richard Vanderveen won in that special election. And sure enough, on the evening news that night with Peter Jennings, they went live to a correspondent with Peter in the election headquarters of Vanderveen, and they talked to the campaign manager. I can't remember who it was, and he was in front of a map of the 3rd District, and damned if he didn't point to my precinct right there, which was doing really, really well, and because it was turning, it was a bellwether precinct, this is an indication that Vanderveen in the early going was probably going to win, because if this precinct went, it meant that it was a signal that something was going on, something was afoot. Well, of course, I was like beaming on my day of suspension, from high school. And suddenly I was participating in this revolution that was taking place right here in Grand Rapids. And the boy from Syracuse who'd gone to Woodstock as a junior high school student, and asked the stupid question of Jerry Ford, had totally redeemed himself by being a part of democracy, but not as a smartass asking a question, but as a campaign worker seeing how voters make decisions and real change happens. And of course, the fact that I got on the evening news only made my mother angry. I said, you never get punished for anything. You always come up smelling like a rose. What is it about you? It's been a discourse between my mother and I, really for the last 54 years, I think it's fair to say. So, of course, Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976. That was the end of Richard Vanderveen. The district went back to the GOP, and it's been that way ever since. I'm pretty sure. I don't think there was a believed to be a serious challenge in the 3rd District in this election, and the Republicans took it overwhelmingly. So what's going on? There is a tradition of switching. There is a tradition of moments of change being times when people feel, and it's a combination of both, where certain people feel like, wow, my vote matters, so I'm going down to the polls. But it's generally coupled with a view, my vote doesn't matter, so I'm going to stay home. And when that combination happens, you get extraordinary reversals. And that's what happened in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected. You had a combination of a Democratic insurgency, not unlike the Tea Party, coming in enabled by the internet, challenging the Democratic leadership in the form of the Clintons and Hillary Clinton, and Bill Clinton and the sort of Democratic centrist movement that had been so powerful in the 1990s that it had basically co-opted the Republican Party in the 90s after the 94 Republican Gingrich election. You had this insurgency of Barack Obama coming in and grabbing people's sense of, I want change, and oh my God, there's a moment here where my vote matters, coupled with a huge national disillusionment by the second term of George W. Bush. And the reason why Barack Obama has failed to capitalize on what happened here is exactly the same story of Jimmy Carter in 1976, and it's really a story that is echoed all the way back to Abraham Lincoln If you look at the insurgency that brought Lincoln in 1860, where suddenly the United States, through this crazy bunch of lunatic, abolitionists, anti-American Republicans who challenged the Democratic Party and won the election, thereby bringing on the secession and everything that became the Civil War, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But there you have an insurgency, a moment of change, and a disillusionment among Democrats in 1860 that the Democratic Party was even capable of dealing with this huge issue of slavery that they'd made all these compromises on. They'd done these sort of centrist kind of partial solutions to, but it wasn't working. The tension between the North and the South was going to blow. The Democrats were not capable of dealing with it, and there was huge disillusionment. And so the Republicans got this moment of power. Activist Republicans in 1860 plus disillusioned, I guess I'll stay home Democrats, told the story in 1860. Told the story in 1976. Disillusioned Republicans who'd finally just sort of had it with the Nixon, and then the legacy of poor Gerald Ford, who basically had to carry on his shoulders everything that Nixon had given to him, and his, in history, brilliant notion to pardon the president so that we could move on also meant that moving on was moving on to Democrats. And so, you know, the perhaps bravest political impulse of our age becomes an example of what Americans do at the voting booth. They don't reward you necessarily for those brave impulses. They look for their own way to express change. And so by 1976, you have Republicans disillusioned. An insurgency within the Republican Party, by the way, in the form of Ronald Reagan, which would be much more significant by 1980, who was siphoning off sort of energized Republicans into this new wave, this kind of Tea Party-like movement of conservatism that goes back to '64 and Goldwater, which failed to challenge LBJ. But with that in the background, the combination of Democrats going, all right, this is our moment. Nixon has screwed the pooch, you know, with the 1974, the Watergate thing. Look at Vanderveen won in Jerry Ford's district. We're going to win this. Carter comes in. Obama comes in 08. Abraham Lincoln comes in 1860. And so what is the impulse of the presidents in most of these cases? In our time, the impulse typically is to construe this moment as a mandate. That the voters have spoken in a clear term about where we go from here. And in part, if you look at some of the books that have been written about Barack Obama, the interpretation of 2008 was, we've turned the corner, we want to change America's identity in the world, which there probably was more consensus about that than anything that Obama ran on. We want to deal with the economy, and Obama, by basically agreeing to the end of the second term Bush agenda on bailing out the banks and carrying that forward with Timothy Geithner and the economic team, who pretty much had perfect straight line continuity between what Bush did and then what Obama carried forward. Probably would have been differences of opinion on the stimulus package. Obama focused on health care, because health care was the mandate of the people. Now we're going to take care of something that hasn't been taken care of at the time. The stimulus will take care of itself. The economy, because we bailed out the banks, will take care of itself. And so he set himself on a path of taking a huge political risk on health care, one that Bill Clinton botched back in 1992, 93, 94, and didn't get done. And really left behind the fact that there were 8 million jobs lost in the U.S. economy, and every single one of those 8 million was a potential angry, disillusioned voter who either would decide, well, I'm going to find a place where my vote is meaningful, which became the Tea Party, or stay home, which became the low African-American turnout and the low progressive base turnout of the Democratic Party on Tuesday. So, easy for me to say, Barack Obama, you blew it. But presidents do, and I think Bush is an example of this, they fail to see that these high expectations are not mandates. They are high expectations. And high expectations, a mandate is sort of what FDR got in the 1930s. Fix this, give us money, put us back to work. And that's what he focused on. If there was a mandate for Barack Obama, it was probably closer to that than it was actually get involved in a huge political battle over health care. Oh, and by the way, make sure that most of the important elements of the health care bill don't go into effect until your second term, 2014, another tactical mistake, which FDR would never have made. FDR, if he had decided to do health care, would have basically done the health care bill that gives you money when you're sick bill. It would be so people would go, oh, wow, I don't want to go back to work. I want to get sick. And FDR is going to give me money, and I'm going to vote for the Democrats, and he's going to be in power, until there's a war. I mean, that's the classic kind of patronage approach. Harder to do now because the U.S. is a different kind of economy. So instead, Barack Obama focused on a very abstract political battle that became health care. The economy sort of floated along. The angst and anger that benefited him in 2008 abandoned him in 2010 and became movements like the Tea Party. Now, how do we assess the Tea Party's success on Tuesday? I mean, on the one hand, in places like where the bar was really high, like Washington State, the Tea Party lost. And there it was about the Democrats getting out the vote, and the state is sort of tailor-made geographically to help a Democrat in a situation like this. Obama visits Seattle. It's basically get out the Democratic vote in Seattle, Patty Murray wins. And so you see one of the few campaign appearances for a specific candidate as opposed to these kind of general town meeting kinds of affairs that Obama was doing in the last days of the campaign was in Washington State, where they understood that they had a lever that they could really pull in Washington. But look at West Virginia. Anybody follow the West Virginia race? Joe Manchin, popular governor, won as a Democrat by running against Barack Obama, like specifically running against Barack Obama. And his commercial is one of the more famous commercials of the entire campaign, right? Where he's seen in the commercial taking a rifle and shooting the cap and trade bill, which of course was a moot point because the bill which Republicans called the energy tax and the carbon tax, and effectively rebranded the whole cap and trade, sustainability, we're going to do something intelligent about energy ideas that were a part of Barack Obama's rhetoric of challenge to authority in 2008 became the carbon tax of 2009, and the Senate wasn't going to go there, the House wasn't going to go there, and so Joe Manchin uses it as a campaign ad, shooting a bill that's already dead, by the way. Hey, Sarah Palin hunts from a helicopter, okay? That's messing with the rules, too. But so what is the future of the Democratic coalition if Joe Manchin, a popular Democratic governor, is one of the few real bright spots for the Democrats on Tuesday? Marco Rubio, the Florida winner and the one real Tea Party insurgent, takes out Charlie Crist, the Republican, forces him to run as an independent. He succeeds in the crucial state of Florida, where senators are very, very important in delivering constituencies for national candidates. So the character who is most set up to be in your news cycle every day between now and 2012 is Marco Rubio, the Republican in Florida. Is he a Tea Party candidate, or is he a centrist who benefited from the Tea Party mathematics of a three-way race? It's unclear. It's unclear. But it's very, very, very interesting. The mirror image of that race is up in Alaska, where Murkowski, as a write-in, the GOP stalwart, Murkowski is going to win. against Joe Miller, the Tea Party candidate, on the home turf of Sarah Palin. So if Sarah Palin can't deliver a Tea Party senator in her own state, as victorious as the Tea Party seems on Tuesday's result, that's a huge sort of liability as a national. I mean, if you're a, Citizens United, write the big campaign check kind of who's the kingmaker I'm going to make, whether you're on the Democrat or Republican side, if you're looking for something to invest in that'll turn out better than Meg Whitman in California, you got $141.6 million to just invest in yourself. That's what they say in corporate America. You need to invest in yourself and your people, and you'll go far. Except in California politics. No, poor Meg Whitman. But if you're thinking of writing checks, you're going to think twice about Sarah Palin's inability to deliver Alaska for the Tea Party, if indeed she's a Tea Party candidate. And of course, the GOP has to think very, very clearly now about what is its identity. Do we embrace the Tea Party? Do we co-opt the Tea Party? Or do we just tolerate them? And there's these two factions that will eventually come to a head in the 1980 election for the GOP, which resulted in the Reagan Revolution. That was an insurgency. The sort of Dick Cheney, Ford, Rumsfeld, Kissinger wing of the Republican Party was ousted by Ronald Reagan and his insurgents of real conservatives. And of course, if you ask conservatives and the people in the GOP now, the Republican Party began with Ronald Reagan. There was no history before. And if you go on the Glenn Beck show, you hear about Woodrow Wilson, his obsession with Woodrow Wilson. Blanche Lincoln, John Boozman, the Arkansas Senate race, very, very interesting. Blanche Lincoln, a Democrat who helped Obama on the financial regulation bill, who actually had some very interesting ideas because, as head of the Agriculture Committee, she's in charge of the oversight of the commodities markets and was in a really unique position as a woman to think clearly about this commoditization of securities, which resulted in the extreme high-risk elements of the subprime meltdown, where you create stocks out of mortgages, turn them into commodities like pork bellies, sell them on sort of off markets, unregulated markets, like Goldman Sachs had in these derivative trades, and she wanted to pull that back, and she was really the guiding person who created the financial regulations that are even as tepid as they are, helped financial regulation get passed. Now, we can debate whether that's a good idea or not, and there are plenty of people now in the GOP in the House who want to roll that back. But she got punished for doing that. And John Kasich, who worked for Goldman Sachs as a consultant, or Lehman Brothers as a consultant before they went down, is elected governor of Ohio. So clearly the message that the Obama administration tried to project in its first 2 years was utterly lost. And what took its place was this pocket of anger called the Tea Party, of newly engaged people, and some of them are African Americans. African American vote turnout in the United States on Tuesday was in double digits for Republicans. The number, or the rate of voting for Republicans among African Americans was like 11% for the first time in at least a decade and a half. So suddenly you have people, because of the recession and having lost their jobs, see this window of, my vote means something if I vote Republican and they're African Americans. That's a huge window that's opening that we really haven't seen in the identity of the Republican and Democratic Party since really the 1860s and Reconstruction, where the Republican Party was the party of the people and the party of all men are created equal and the party of racial equality. And the Democratic Party was the party of segregation and maintaining this sort of fiction of the North and the South. And then the identity is sort of reversed during the Civil War, or during the Civil Rights Movement, and the Democrats became this party not of segregation. They became the party of the Civil Rights Act by LBJ, and the Republicans became this sort of other identity, which was sort of internationalist in some wings and sort of socially conservative by the time you get to Reagan. So all these identities are in play here. It would be wrong to call Tuesday either a repudiation of the Obama agenda or the development of something fundamentally new. It's the great switcheroo in the sense that the Van der Veens of the world cannot survive in a place that is fundamentally of a certain political identity. And Western Michigan is a fundamentally, 3rd District, is a fundamentally Republican identified place. And unless there's a serious sort of political challenge to the Republicans in Western Michigan that has real meaning to the way people live in Western Michigan, as opposed to being one of these moments where I'm sick of those people in Washington, so I'm staying home, versus we can win, so we're all going to vote, one of those kind of moments, that doesn't last. Obama failed to see that the stickiness of his message would determine how he's going to do in 2010. And basically deciding to roll up his sleeves and just be a Washington president who looks pretty good and gives some decent speeches only says, oh, now you're the target. It's basically putting a target around your own face, at which he did very effectively. Lincoln did the exact same thing in the 1860s, and I'll end with this, and then we'll do questions for the rest of the time. Lincoln in 1860 said, well, at this very terrible time in America's history, I've been asked by not a majority of the people, but enough to make me president to take care of this crisis. And so he rolled up his sleeve, and for the first 2 terms was absolutely sort of run rings around by his own generals, McClellan and others, who said, you don't know anything about war, leave it to us. And if you look at the history of the Civil War for the Union, in the first 2 years of the Lincoln presidency, it was an utter debacle. And Lincoln, as he studied up on his history and his military history and gradually began to take control of the war and hire folks like Ulysses Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman to come in and actually take the initiative from General Lee, who Lincoln had wanted to lead the Union, but apparently wasn't available. And Lee even himself considered it at a certain point, but that's another piece of history. Lincoln was on the ropes by 1862. And there were huge reversals. The Republicans had huge reversals all around the United States, very low turnout. There were huge reversals, and there was this movement that developed of angry people who wanted to take back their country called the Copperheads. Look it up. It's one of the great ironies of American history. They named themselves after the Liberty Penny in the 1850s, which was made out of copper. They called themselves the Copperheads. They hated Lincoln with a passion. They believed he was destroying the country by intervening among small businesses who owned slaves and forcing them to free their slaves. He said this, the solution to the problem is to end the war and forget about this slavery business and just sort of go back to the way it used to be. That was the Copperheads' message. And they had a huge convention and would have won. And it's in Lincoln's own papers, a letter that he wrote concluding that he could not possibly win in 1864 and that it was all over for him. And he was beginning to think about what would the country do if the Democrats came back to power and the war was still going on. And within a week of the Copperhead Convention, sort of this Glenn Beck kind of on the mall moment of we're taking back our country, here we come, Mr. President, Atlanta fell. And this decisive battle changed everything. And so what that says to us today is Obama's got 2 things he has to think about between now and 2012 if he wants to be a 2-term president. There's the Carter scenario, which is continue to roll up your sleeves, do not articulate your message, be reactive, hope that the Republicans, Mitch McConnell's, haven't learned any lessons from 1994 where they turned Bill Clinton into a martyr and made him this Democratic powerhouse. You can hope that they overreach in 94. Otherwise, he'll turn out like Jimmy Carter. Or he's got to look for a fall of Atlanta moment. What is the fall of Atlanta? The end of the war. We've entered a new era moment that transforms Lincoln from a troubled, intellectual, anxiety-ridden president who can't quite articulate his message to being the greatest president America has ever known. It's all embodied in that sort of period between 1862 and 1864. And you got to figure, if you're in the corridors of the White House and you're Barack Obama, you got to be thinking about Jimmy Carter and Abraham Lincoln. 1976, back when I was still having embarrassing moments in Western Michigan, not even a journalist yet, the seeds of what's going on today were very much in play. So that's my interpretation of what happened on Tuesday and how to think about the future and how to drown out the kind of Olbermann-y, Glenn Beckian sort of noise that's going to try to declare this is what's actually happening. To give you a sense of the complexity about how I look at it as a journalist and where the really interesting stories are. Joe Manchin, really interesting story. Whether Rubio decides to be a national figure or to stay in Florida and develop a base there, really interesting story. Whether Barack Obama can truly embrace a message that will try to restore his identity with the anger, identical anger in 2008 as you see in the Tea Party in 2010, restore that anger to his own personal domain, or continue to be reactive and end up, with the Afghan war looking a lot like Jimmy Carter's failed hostage rescue attempt. Two wars going on right now, both of which are longer. Let's see, in a year, both of which will be longer than Vietnam. Afghanistan already is. So thanks so much for letting me talk too much and sound too liberal here in Western Michigan in this beautiful setting. And if we have questions, you can shout them out. I'll repeat them back so that if they decide to do audio on this event, we'll be able to hear the questions. But go ahead and raise your hands.
So first of all, I want to lead the applause.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Do we have time for a few questions?
Thank you very much. We do, and we also have somebody with a microphone. So
Oh,
if
great.
you could please use the microphone.
So
that'd
raise
be
your
great,
hands.
And I'll let you conduct this like a
Great.
classroom.
There we go.
Sir, thank you very much.
We've got a mic for you. So my producers who are going to put this on audio would love to hear your crystal clear voice.
Excellent. Happy to do so. Delighted. Do you think the discourse today within the media is really anything different than it has been since probably John Adams?
Since John Adams, no. But since the FCC and the existence of the three television networks as a result of the kind of huge broadcast monopoly moment that happened really from the late 1930s pretty much until the advent of cable, when cable television created this tipping point that allowed Ted Turner to create CNN and then propped up all of these various sorts of TV outlets, and then of course the internet hugely accelerating the diversity of messages in media political discourse. No, I mean, we've returned in a sense to what I think in the business we call the Hearst era, which very much is an echo of the John Adams era, where media outlets are affiliated and associated explicitly with political missions and programs, and that is in fact how they articulate their discussion and what goes on in their pages. And to embrace that is to be more civically engaged, whereas to sit back, as we all did in the 1970s, and assume that Walter Cronkite and Huntley and Brinkley were just these Olympian custodians of the truth, and didn't have anything else to do but give us the truth in those huge numbers when we aggregated around the television in the evening, in numbers that any network, I mean, Keith Olbermann gets 1 million listeners. Morning Edition, the NPR morning program that you hear on the public radio station here and is heard around the nation, gets an audience of 11 million. Rush Limbaugh gets an audience of between 10 and 13 million. If you take his full week, he gets up to 14 million sometimes. Bill O'Reilly may get may get 1 million on a good night. And my audience, for the takeaway, even though it's not a national audience, it's on in New York, and it's on in Detroit, and Atlanta, and Miami, and Denver, and a bunch of other smaller cities around the United States. We regularly pull 1 million. Chris Matthews is lucky if he can get 300,000 people every day, and yet these are portrayed as the Cronkites of our era, and of course they're not. The numbers have completely changed. The audience has totally abandoned them. So to embrace and focus on the blog that you like and the Politico.com that you think is astute is to do what most of the rest of the world is doing, and that is if you're in London, you buy The Guardian. If you think that the Labour Party should be more liberal, you buy The Independent. If you think the Labour Party should be more conservative, you buy The Times if you're a Tory, and you buy The Telegraph if you're a Tory who thinks the Tories should go to the right, and that's all is right with the world in that situation. I think the big mistake and the huge anxiety about civic engagement that I talked about at the beginning is all about this mixture we have. The person that's on the news is somehow not like me. They're a Uber citizen in some sense, and so they're manipulating me. They're not talking to me. And so if they are biased in some sense, they're poisoning me, rather than assuming that, which is kind of a mixture of, I want my Glenn Beck to be, Walter Cronkite, which is like, Glenn Beck, and Cronkite was this huge sort of cultural figure who was just a person like the rest of us and had this gigantic audience. I mean, Glenn Beck is a sort of a bobblehead compared to Walter Cronkite, but you don't want to confuse Cronkite with Beck, and I'm not talking about journalistic credentials. I mean, what Beck says is a tiny slice of a full spectrum of political discourse. What Cronkite said was heard by almost all of America, and so was a different form of discourse. It's that moment that has ended, and that moment was just a moment. We grew up, many of us, if you're around my age, believing that the sort of FCC-enforced broadcast monopoly of the television networks, which the newspapers began to envy, and you had the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the LA Times and the Chicago Tribune leaving their conservative and liberal identities and trying to become like the networks, of having this like pure organ of record quality to them. And the problem with all the newspapers is organ of record, there's only one. There's not 5. There's not 10 organs of record. It's just not a business model that's sustainable. So the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times are struggling to try to maintain this newspaper of the nation, and USA Today is right in there as well. And they're not all going to survive. But what will survive are lots and lots and lots of argumentative, opinionated journalists and bloggers and opinion providers that will constitute part, but only part, of the discourse of civic engagement. And the extent to which that works for American democracy is the extent to which people don't just sit on their couch and go, well, Glenn Beck the other day said, and that must be true. Or Bill O'Reilly said the other day, and that must be, or Keith Olbermann really nailed that. If you passively just sort of adopt your position and don't do anything more than that, then democracy is threatened, as it was in the Hearst era, as it was in the period of John Adams. But if you go back, there's a great book that I recommend to everyone here called Ratification. It's just been published. It's by a historian out of MIT named Pauline Baird, I think, or something like that. I'll find it. You can Google ratification. It's all about the debate that took place in the communities around the colonies at the time. Or they weren't colonies, this brand new nation, under the Articles of Confederation, about ratification of the Constitution, and how the debate went. And it's the stories of speeches given by farmers, and as well as the John Adamses of the world, as to what we needed, and hugely informed and passionate arguments about what the president will do versus what Congress will do, and what the courts will do, and how they'll interact, and whether we need that, and and great stories about people who believed the federal government was a savior in the chaos of the late 1700s versus people who believed that the federal government was a disguise for reinstating some sort of monarchical system that England was all about. Brilliant, beautiful. They make you cry to hear just the informed as well as opinionated qualities of all of these people. Not a mention of gridlock in the entire bunch. And it really, it's that we need to get back to, and it's almost more a consumer impulse that's going to improve the discourse in America rather than relying on the Stephen Colberts and the Jon Stewarts and the Glenn Becks to do it. And I actually was, as entertained as I am by Colbert and Stewart, I was offended by the mall being turned into a branding mechanism for Comedy Central, just as I was offended by Glenn Beck pretending like he was, bringing on some tsunami of change with his little, every cable. Rachel Ray could do a mall thing, cook some stuff up, have a band play, talk about freedom. Hey, but what have we done with the iconography of America if that's our approach? Other questions? Right over here. Spectacular yellow tie.
Sorry for the delay. You touched on an issue in your presentation of the Republican Party having to deal with the Tea Party, and how do they ultimately ignore it, or do they co-opt it? How does it go? How is it going to fit in? And I may not have all these facts correct, but I think my question will be the same. I'm working on facts that I've heard in the last 48 hours
Sure.
since the election. Michelle Bachmann, I heard, was considered to be a leader, if not the leader, of the Tea Party. That was one person's opinion. I also heard that she is looking for the number 4 position in Congress, whatever that position is, but that the old guard, so to speak, of the Republican Party are not supporting her. They have other names that they're putting forward. Is this an issue that we should be watching in the next few days? If Michelle Bachmann doesn't get the job that she's looking for, whatever
Committee
it is,
assignment. It's a committee assignment.
Yeah.
It's a leadership position. Right?
Is that going to be a signal to the Tea Party that the Republican Party, isn't interested in them, isn't going to support them?
Well, you've astutely identified what is absolutely going to be the narrative over the next several weeks. Between now and January, when the Congress is impaneled, the parties have leadership assignments to make, and certain leadership individuals are out. Russ Feingold in the Senate is out in Wisconsin, and there are many others whose jobs are gone. Barney Frank, because the House has gone Republican, will no longer be chairman of the Financial Services Committee, so his huge role in being the architect of financial regulation vanishes like that. And there are a couple of battles going on. Bachmann is in the House, and the issues in the House are more pointed because they have majority positions to create. And individuals in the House, because they will be majority party chairs, will be in a position to launch, not only to reflect what is the leadership identity of the GOP, which in part they will, if the bloc or if a caucus develops within the House that is the Tea Party, the Tea Party caucus in the House, and call themselves that will be one narrative. If there is a group of conservatives that say they're the Tea Party, but they don't sort of vote as a bloc, but every once in a while it sort of comes up as an issue, kind of like the social conservatives as a distinct group within the Reagan Republican GOP, but we're not a specific caucus. And in fact, we're denied mostly leadership positions by the GOP leadership. They really weren't let in the door. They were sort of humored. And there was a lot of bitterness actually during the 90s as a result of all of that. And social conservatives were very, very hard on the Republican leadership during the 1990s. And some of that you saw reflected in the campaign event where the Tea Party got together with the Ralph Reed political groups in Washington and tried to make nice with each other, even though they came from completely different worlds. So you're seeing a lot of coalitions trying to be formed. In the Senate, it's completely different, and the story in the Senate is what's going to happen to Murkowski. She will caucus with the Republicans, she will win in Alaska, but she will be an independent. She will be an independent. So there are two questions there. The GOP leadership can, in a face-saving way, not put her in a leadership position because she ran as an independent and won, and she challenged the Republican bloc that wanted her to stay out of the race and just was willing to accept the Palin candidate from Alaska as being in the Senate. Well, that didn't happen. And then you've got this very interesting bloc within the Senate. You've got Mitch McConnell, who's the sort of standard bearer of the Republican leadership, who's a very conservative individual in the Senate. We've also got Jim DeMint of South Carolina, who has absolutely said he is the leader of the Tea Party and wants to get Marco Rubio and they are, together with the new fellow, what's his name, Boozman in Arkansas, and to create this conservative wedge block in the Senate that will try to have power. And because the Senate is still Democratic, that wedge group will have more power because symbolically people will listen to them as a bloc in the Senate, whereas in the House, it's harder for you to be an opposition bloc within your own party because of the way the House works procedurally. So if Murkowski is denied a senior position by the Republicans, and that's given to a Tea Party conservative as a way of buying off the Jim DeMint faction within the Senate, this is how you're going to see the GOP trying to deal with what do we do with the Tea Party. Because the electoral result, the numbers, the pure numbers, aren't big enough for somebody to be for it to be a no-brainer. And so that's what you're going to see. And Bachmann's one example. There are going to be half a dozen other examples in the House. The Murkowski story is the early one in the Senate. Right over here. Last question. Do we have a woman for the last question? All right, right over here.
I am a little muddled. It seemed from every direction you heard the word centrist. You've used it today. Could you give me your definition of actually what the centrist, what it means? What you feel it when people say, I am a centrist, or I am rather than a liberal or a conservative?
Well, I think there's a lot going on there. I mean, I think
I got completely twisted.
Centrist is a kind of a synonym for independent in America right now. There's no centrist position as there is, for instance, in Iran, where there are literally centrists who don't believe that the clerics should control the government, but who don't also want to go back to the way it was under the Shah. They want an Islamic government. I mean, that's a very identifiable centrist position. In the United States, the center of the country was very easy to see up until the period of Nixon, when he got into trouble, or when he campaigned in 1968, talking about the silent majority. He was basically referring to a middle class that basically had defined America economically from the 1930s to the post-war period, where you had the struggles of the Depression becoming the working middle class, people who benefited from the GI Bill, people who became homeowners, people who moved to the suburbs, and found great prosperity in the 50s and 60s. That became the centrist demographic of America. Now, they had all kinds of political positions, and when you see the people in the suburbs moving sort of more conservative, people inside the cities who still maintained that their prosperity, even though the cities were troubled in the 1970s, moving in different political directions. And so the issue of what is the middle class and do they have a distinct political identity, that hasn't been true for a long, long time. The only time centrism had meaning politically, it was within the Democratic Party what Bill Clinton did within the Democratic Party in the 1990s. He created the Democratic Leadership Council, which basically confronted the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which was sort of left over from McGovern, and the Kennedy, Eugene McCarthy challenges to the LBJ establishment in the government, in the Democratic Party, to create an anti-war candidacy that would also be a progressive candidacy on a whole other range of issues, which is why the Southern Democrats left the Democratic Party, which is why Nixon won in '68 and why he won hugely in 1972. And so Bill Clinton said, we got to get back to the center, which basically meant just be Nixon. I mean, he essentially just became a Republican who was more concerned about international trade, and he talked a good game about health care, but didn't really do anything about it except hold a bunch of meetings. And he was so politically infantile that he had the remotest idea what to do with Congress except reacting to the impeachment. I mean, Monica Lewinsky taught Bill Clinton, aside from what only they know, she taught him how to deal with Congress as a defensive play. He never understood how to deal as an offense. But within the Democratic Party, he created this centrist movement which basically destroyed the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And that centrist idea within the Democratic Party has political significance. It doesn't deliver the country for a candidate, but it has political significance. The question about the Tea Party, and the one that you've posed right here, is really defining, is there a centrist notion within the Republican Party? And what is that? It's actually very hard for you to see from the 3rd District in Michigan because, the 3rd District Republican in Michigan has always been a centrist, a sort of, hey, we're like all other Republicans, right? Well, hop in your car and go out to Nevada, or to Arizona, where, Republican means you hang out by the border with your gun and shoot at immigrants coming across the border. I mean, the GOP's diversity, it doesn't totally mean that, but that's one of the, you probably wouldn't do much of that here. You just wait for the deer in the 3rd District, right? So that's a very important question, and I don't think any candidate, and you also have the income disparities are so wide at this point, where the rich are super rich, and the poor are 15% of the United States at this point, under the poverty line. The subprime mortgage crisis basically slammed the door on entrance to the middle class of huge demographics around the country who had a chance to get into a home, and because of the way the banks manipulated the subprime mortgages, that's gone now, and these people are coming off of unemployment benefits over the next 12 months. So the political demographic shifts involving the middle class are hugely significant, and what centrist looks like in 2012 or 2022 is really going to be the narrative of what America is in the 21st century. Thanks so much for spending time, and this has been great.